At 8 in the morning on payroll day, I watched my banking app flash a glaring red warning restricted hold. Someone had touched my employees' salaries, but the real shock was not the frozen funds. It was walking into the private banking suite to find my parents waiting with pristine portfolios. They did not come to explain. They came to use this manufactured crisis to steal control of my company before the day was over. My name is Penelope Rutherford. I am 38 years old, and I built Northline Workforce Advisory from a folding table in a leased storage unit into a powerhouse firm managing thousands of workforce contracts across the state. I know my business inside and out, but more importantly, I know the lifeblood of my business. I know my money. On a standard payroll morning, the rhythm of my life is usually perfectly predictable. The alarm goes off at 5 in the morning. The automated clearinghouse files are batched by the processing center. The liquidity reserves are calculated against our incoming receivables, and the outbound treasury streams are authorized. It is a seamless, invisible ballet of capital moving from my corporate accounts into the pockets of the people who keep the gears of the industry turning. But this morning, that rhythm was violently shattered. I stood in my kitchen, the early morning light barely filtering through the blinds, and opened my corporate banking application on my secured tablet to verify the final disbursement queue. Instead of the familiar green validation checkmarks, a banner rendered in stark, aggressive red blocked the entire interface. Restricted hold. The letter sat heavy and immovable over the Northline primary payroll account. I did not gasp. I did not drop my coffee cup. I did not begin frantically dialing my executive team or my software vendors. Panic is a luxury for people who do not understand how financial infrastructure actually operates. In the high-tier corporate banking world, money does not simply freeze because of a phantom glitch or a routine system error. Cash is a physical force. It possesses momentum. It stops moving only when a human hand reaches directly into the machinery and actively forces it to halt. Someone had deliberately choked the lifeblood of my company, and they had timed it for the exact moment it would cause the maximum amount of collateral damage. I did not message my chief operating officer. I certainly did not call my parents. I walked calmly to my home office safe, retrieved my primary corporate identification matrix and my physical cryptographic authentication token, and left my house. The drive to the Summit Harbor Bank branch in the affluent Aquiet district of Ashby Grove took exactly 22 minutes. I drove my car with mechanical precision. I spent those minutes in absolute silence, calculating threat vectors, analyzing every vendor relationship, and mentally auditing every single executive who had clearance to touch the treasury tier. By the time I parked my car and walked through the heavy, reinforced glass doors of the private wealth management wing, my heart rate was perfectly level. I was not a victim stumbling into a disaster. I was a chief executive officer walking into a war zone. The Ashby Grove branch of Summit Harbor Bank is specifically designed to make high-net-worth clients feel insulated from the harsh realities of the world. Thick, custom-woven carpets swallow the sound of footsteps completely. Rich walnut paneling and frosted glass partitions create an illusion of absolute discretion and unwavering safety. But as I rounded the corner toward the dedicated corporate advisory suites, that carefully curated illusion broke entirely. Through the seamless, soundproof glass wall of the primary conference room, I saw them. My father, Graham Rutherford, and my mother, Elise Rutherford, were seated side by side at the massive polished mahogany table. They looked entirely too comfortable. They had pristine, leather-bound portfolios laid out in front of them, the pages neatly indexed and aligned with the meticulous care of executives preparing for a hostile board takeover. They were not sipping the complimentary artisanal coffee. They were not reading the financial papers. They were simply waiting. They had manufactured a crisis, and now they were sitting in the exact center of the blast radius, fully expecting me to arrive in a state of emotional ruin. Standing at the head of the table was Adrian Pike, the regional branch manager. Adrian was usually a man composed of smooth smiles, tailored Italian suits, and endless golf course anecdotes. Right now, his posture was rigidly defensive. He held his banking tablet against his chest like a ballistic shield. His eyes darted nervously toward the door as I approached down the hallway. The sheer caution radiating from his frame confirmed everything I needed to know before I even touched the handle. This was not an administrative misunderstanding. Adrian knew exactly how radioactive this situation was, and he knew he was caught in the crossfire. I pushed the heavy glass door open. The hinges glided in total silence, sealing the room behind me. "Good morning, Adrian," I said. My voice was entirely flat, modulated to strip away any trace of adrenaline. I did not look at my parents. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the branch manager. Adrian swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing above his tight collar. "Penelope, good morning. We were just discussing the irregular security flag on the North Line distribution profile." Before Adrian could finish his sentence, my father leaned forward. Graham Rutherford always commanded a room by acting as though he already owned the building. He adjusted the pristine cuffs of his bespoke charcoal suit and gave me a look of deep, manufactured paternal concern. It was a look he had perfected over decades of corporate negotiations. "Penelope, sit down," Graham said, his tone low and soothing. "Take a breath. We are just helping stabilize the payroll system. You have been running yourself into the ground lately. You are entirely overworked, and honestly, you should not be handling large cash flows right now. Not in your current state." The sheer audacity of the framing was breathtaking. He was not just trying to intercept my operating capital. He was actively trying to establish a narrative of mental instability right in front of my primary banker. My mother chimed in immediately, her timing practiced to absolute perfection. Elise Rutherford smiled, a sweet maternal expression that did not reach the cold, calculating geometry of her eyes. "We are only stepping in because we care about you, darling," Elise said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth that cut like a scalpel. "You should really be thanking your family. We noticed the immense strain you were under, and we took the initiative to find a much safer distribution route for the payroll. Everything is going to be handled smoothly. You just need to step back, relax, and let us manage the heavy lifting for a while." They expected me to snap. It was the entire point of the ambush. They wanted me to scream, to accuse them of theft, to throw a dramatic temper tantrum in the middle of a private banking suite so Adrian could diligently note my erratic, unhinged behavior in his official client logs. They wanted to present the image of the hysterical, crumbling daughter needing rescue by her steady, experienced parents. I gave them absolutely nothing. I did not acknowledge their presence with a greeting. I did not respond to the emotional bait. I walked directly to the empty leather chair beside Adrian, placed my corporate identification firmly on the mahogany wood, and set my physical authentication token right next to it. "Adrian," I said, keeping my tone strictly professional, utterly devoid of any familial connection, "I am the sole authorized signatory and the primary fiduciary for Northline Workforce Advisory. I am instructing you, right now, as my banker, to open the raw audit trail for the primary payroll account on the main wall monitor. I will not engage in emotional, subjective debates in a conference room. Show me the digital logs." Adrian hesitated. He looked from my unblinking, hard stare to the formidable, heavy presence of my father across the table. He was paralyzed by the conflicting authority. "Adrian," I repeated, my voice dropping a fraction of an octave, turning from a firm request into an absolute, unyielding command. "You are managing an account holding hundreds of thousands of dollars of employee livelihoods. If you do not display the security logs within the next 10 seconds, I will have my external legal counsel bypass your branch entirely and file an immediate federal complaint for the unauthorized freezing of commercial assets." "Screen, now," Adrian exhaled sharply, defeated by the immediate, undeniable legal threat. He tapped the surface of his tablet, and the large, high-definition monitor mounted on the far wall flared to life. Rows of dense transaction data, security flags, and time-stamped access requests rapidly populated the screen, glowing sharply in the dim light of the conference room. I ignored the glaring red restricted banner at the top and looked straight at the underlying command architecture. My eyes tracked the latest system entries. Scanning the digital footprints, there it was. The absolute, undeniable smoking gun. At 6 in the morning, an external request had been injected into the Summit Harbor system. It was not an automated fraud hold triggered by an unknown hacker. It was a formal Treasury redirection protocol. The command explicitly instructed the bank to halt the standard automated clearinghouse distributions and reroute the entire Northline payroll batch into a completely off-system holding account. I traced the authorization code attached to the routing request. It bypassed my dual-factor authentication entirely. It bypassed my Treasury software. It was pushed through using a legacy contact authority. It was an archaic, deeply buried permission tier that my parents had somehow retained from the very first months of the company's existence, back when we used a joint seed capital account to cover initial vendor expenses. They had dug up a ghost key from years ago, dusted it off, and used it to bypass the modern security architecture to hijack my financial infrastructure. I stared at the glowing lines of data on the screen, the cold, harsh reality of their ambition fully crystallizing in my mind. This was never about helping a stressed daughter. This was a calculated, bloodless financial coup. They were using my employees' paychecks as leverage to pry the keys to my empire from my hands. Starting with the most vulnerable point of any company, I finally turned my head slowly and looked directly at my father. I did not yell. I did not cry. I simply smiled, a razor-thin expression that mirrored the absolute ice running through his own veins. The battle lines were officially drawn in digital ink, and they had absolutely no idea what kind of war they had just started. The glowing monitor bathed the small conference room in a harsh, clinical light. I did not blink as my eyes scanned the raw data cascading down the screen. Adrian shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the fabric of his suit rustling loudly in the otherwise silent room. He reached forward and tapped a secondary command on his tablet, his finger trembling just enough to be noticeable. A heavily redacted risk control module expanded over the primary audit trail. This was the back end of the bank. The interface clients were never meant to see. There was no system error code. There was no automated fraud block generated by an algorithm. There was only a manual override tag labeled as a temporary Treasury redirect request, and it was currently locked in a frozen status pending a secondary review. I focused on the destination routing number. In standard operations, a payroll batch leaves the primary operating account and drops directly into the vendor clearing system. But this request had severed that line completely. It had instructed the bank to take the entire multi-million-dollar payload and dump it into an external, unverified holding pool. I read the beneficiary name attached to that foreign routing number. It did not say Northline Workforce Advisory. It read Rutherford Reserve Partners. A temporary measure, my father said, his voice dropping into that smooth, authoritative register he used during hostile board meetings. The funds are perfectly secure. Penelope, every single employee will be paid fully and on time. We are simply routing the batch through a much safer family structure before it hits the processor. I kept my gaze locked on the screen. The mechanics of his lie were almost beautiful in their calculated cruelty. He was trying to frame this as a simple administrative detour, but I knew exactly how corporate power functioned. This was not about holding money for safety. If Rutherford Reserve Partners took possession of my payroll, even for a single minute, they became the distributor. They would control the exact time the funds were released. They would control the amount. Most importantly, they would control the narrative. They would send an email to my staff, dripping with false sympathy, explaining that the family had to step in to ensure everyone got paid because the founder was struggling. They would instantly become the saviors, and I would be reduced to a liability in the eyes of the very people who built my company. They wanted to strip away my psychological authority over my own workforce. "Show me the execution logs, Adrian," I ordered, my voice cutting through my father's corporate soothing like glass. A Treasury redirect of this size triggers a mandatory dual verification protocol. It requires a digital signature and a live voice callback. How did this clear the initial security gate? Adrian swallowed visibly. He swiped his tablet again. The screen shifted to the authentication records. The request was initiated at 6 in the morning, Adrian explained, his voice tight. The system flagged it as anomalous and triggered an automated security callback to the legacy administrative phone number on file. I looked at the number displayed on the screen. It was the landline to my parents' estate. A number I had forgotten to purge from the foundational banking documents a decade ago. And the voice verification, I asked. It was completed successfully, Adrian said, looking down at his tablet rather than at me. The biometric voice print matched the secondary founder profile. I finally turned my head and looked at my mother. Elise sat perfectly still, her hands folded neatly over her leather portfolio. She had taken the call. She had calmly spoken into the receiver, imitating my authority, verifying a transaction designed to cripple my business. She met my stare with a look of pure, unyielding maternal entitlement. And the paperwork, I demanded, turning my attention back to the branch manager. A redirect to a newly minted, unrecognized entity requires physical documentation. A voice callback is not enough for a Tier 1 Treasury move. Adrian nodded slowly. Mr. Rutherford submitted a physical authorization package in person at the branch opening this morning. I turned to my father. He did not look away. He slowly unzipped the leather portfolio resting on the mahogany table and slid a thick stack of printed documents toward me. The paper was heavy, expensive, and crisp. I picked up the top document. It was titled as a Continuity of Operations Packet. I scanned the first paragraph, and the sheer audacity of the legal framing made the blood roar in my ears. I forced my breathing to remain perfectly steady. The document outlined a highly specific, aggressively drafted clause. It stated that in the event the primary founder suffered from temporary executive incapacitation, a designated family trust had the explicit right to execute short-term financial interventions to preserve the underlying value of the asset. I flipped to the second page. Attached to the legal framework was a formal statement of condition, drafted on blank stationery, but signed by both my parents. It detailed a series of completely fabricated observations claiming that over the past 4 weeks, I had been exhibiting signs of severe neurological stress. It painted a picture of a chief executive on the verge of a total psychological collapse. They were not just trying to intercept my payroll. They had meticulously built a legal and medical narrative to declare me entirely unfit to manage my own life's work. They had weaponized the concept of mental health to stage a corporate execution. I set the document back down on the table. I did not throw it. I did not tear it. I aligned the edges perfectly with the grain of the wood. The silence in the room was absolute, thick with the kind of tension that precedes a physical impact. My parents watched me, waiting for the explosion. They were ready for the screaming, the tears, the desperate pleas. They had built this entire trap specifically to trigger a reaction that would immediately validate the severe neurological stress they had just documented. I leaned back in my chair, resting my hands on the armrests. I looked at Adrian, then at my mother, and finally settled my gaze entirely on my father. "Who?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the absolute weight of a finalized verdict. "Authorized the use of this specific packet against the payroll of my company." The question hung in the air, cold and lethal. It was not a question of how, it was a question of legal liability. By asking it, I was signaling that I was no longer treating this as a family dispute. I was treating it as corporate espionage and financial fraud. My father's confident posture rigidified by a fraction of an inch. The paternal mask slipped, revealing the ruthless corporate predator underneath. He opened his mouth to deliver his prepared legal defense, but he never got the chance to speak. Behind him, the massive wall monitor emitted a sharp, electronic chime. The sound was bright, jarring, and completely out of place in the heavy atmosphere of the room. Adrian snapped his head toward the screen. The blood instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost trapped in a tailored suit. A new banner had materialized across the top of the risk control interface, flashing in an urgent, aggressive yellow. It was a live system alert, generating in real time. Warning: active session modification detected. Someone was currently inside the banking architecture, while my parents sat across from me, pretending this was a localized intervention to save a single payroll batch. The system was actively being rewritten. I read the scrolling text beneath the warning banner. A new, elevated request had just been submitted from this exact branch network. It was not a request to hold funds. It was an executive mandate attempting to permanently add a new primary signatory to the master Northline corporate profile. They were not just trying to delay the money. They were picking the final lock on the vault while they distracted me in the lobby. I stood up slowly, picking up my authentication token. The game had just changed entirely, and the time for sitting quietly at the table was over. The heavy glass door of the conference room swung open with a sharp click that cut through the stifling tension. A woman stepped inside, her presence immediately displacing Adrian's nervous energy. She wore a sharp navy blazer and carried a secure data pad that looked significantly more advanced than the branch manager's tablet. This was Talia Mercer, the regional director of risk management for Summit Harbor Bank. I knew her by reputation. She did not handle customer service. She handled federal compliance, corporate fraud, and institutional liability. "Nobody touches another terminal," Talia ordered. Her voice was flat, entirely devoid of the polished hospitality Adrian had been trying to maintain. "I have locked the network layer for this branch. Every access modification currently queued in the system is now frozen under a Tier 1 security review." She walked past my parents without offering a greeting, pulled up a chair next to Adrian, and immediately commandeered the wall monitor. The flashing yellow warning banner abruptly vanished, replaced by a dense, monochromatic grid of institutional analytics. The room had officially transitioned from a tense family ambush into a hostile forensic audit. "Let us look at exactly what is trying to attach itself to the Northline master architecture," Talia said, her fingers flying across her datapad. A new document populated the screen. It was the corporate registration file for Rutherford Reserve Partners. My father shifted slightly in his chair, his jaw tightening. "This entity," Talia continued, highlighting a specific row of data, "was legally incorporated exactly 13 days ago. It has zero historical operating data. It has never processed a single commercial transaction. It holds no federal treasury certifications. Yet, this morning, a physical packet was submitted claiming this shell company is a fully vetted professional treasury management service capable of assuming fiduciary control over a multi-million-dollar corporate payroll." Talia turned her head and looked directly at my father. "Mr. Rutherford, submitting a continuity packet to seize operational liquidity is one thing. Attempting to reroute protected employee wages into an unverified, 2-week-old holding tank borders on federal wire fraud." "It is a family trust structure," Graham countered, his tone hardening, dropping the concerned father act entirely. "It is designed to hold the capital in escrow until the executive instability at Northline is resolved. We are well within the legal parameters of the seed capital covenant." I ignored his legal posturing. My eyes were locked on the beneficiary schedule scrolling down the screen. The registration listed the primary managers of the reserve. Graham and Elise were there, acting as the senior trustees. But right below them, buried in the secondary signatory tier, were two names that made the entire chaotic puzzle snap violently into perfect clarity: Daphne Rutherford and her husband, Owen Vale, my sister and my brother-in-law. The air in my lungs turned to ice. This was not a random power grab born out of my parents' obsessive need to control me. This was a desperate, highly calculated financial rescue mission for someone else. Owen was a real estate developer whose ambition consistently outpaced his actual capital. I knew from industry whispers that his latest commercial plaza project was bleeding cash. He had secured a massive short-term bridge loan from Briargate Capital to cover his construction delays. That loan was coming due. To secure a permanent refinancing package or an extension, Owen needed to prove to his institutional lenders that he had absolute ironclad access to stable, recurring corporate liquidity. He needed to show them a massive ecosystem of cash flow that he could theoretically leverage. He did not have that cash flow, but I did. Northline processed massive payroll batches every 2 weeks. To a private equity firm like Briargate Capital, that kind of recurring, high-volume automated clearinghouse traffic looked incredibly attractive. If Owen could show them a verified bank statement proving that a Rutherford family entity was acting as the treasury manager for Northline Workforce Advisory, it would artificially inflate his financial credibility overnight. My payroll was not just money, it was a manufactured credential. It was the exact proof of managed cash flow Owen needed to save his dying bridge loan. If my parents successfully forced my payroll through their shell company for just one single cycle, Owen could take those routing statements, the transaction ledgers, and the temporary treasury confirmation letters directly to Briargate Capital. He would use my employees' wages as a temporary stage prop to secure his own financial survival. I sat back in my chair, absorbing the sheer, breathtaking malice of the trap they had constructed. It was a perfectly designed double bind targeting my reputation. If I fought them aggressively right now, and the bank kept the funds locked under an extended dispute, my payroll would fail to launch today. I would have to look my entire workforce in the eye and explain why their checks bounced. The panic would spread, the trust would shatter, and my parents would immediately use that internal chaos as ultimate proof that I was an incompetent leader. On the other hand, if I gave in, if I signed the temporary release just to ensure my people got paid on time, my parents would instantly become the corporate saviors. They would legitimize Rutherford Reserve Partners. Owen would get his desperately needed collateral proof, and they would have an unbreakable legal precedent showing that I willingly surrendered fiduciary control during a crisis. They thought they had me perfectly pinned in a corner where every exit led directly to my own execution. I kept my face completely neutral. Underneath the mahogany table, out of sight of everyone in the room, I slid my phone out of my pocket. I opened a secure, encrypted messaging channel directly to Noel Vance, my chief operating officer. I typed entirely by touch, a skill I had perfected during hundreds of tedious vendor meetings. Initiate protocol echo, spin up the secondary processor, reroute the raw timecard data. Do not touch the primary accounts. Absolute silence on the floor. Give me a green light when the shadow batch is ready. I sent the message and slipped the phone back into my pocket in one fluid motion. I could not let anyone in this room know I was building a bridge over their heads. I needed them to believe the funds trapped in this bank were my only lifeline. "Talia," I said, projecting a voice of calm, measured reason. "If they submitted the packet 13 days ago, why wait until 8 in the morning on the exact day of disbursement to trigger the redirect?" Talia tapped her screen, pulling up the execution logic. Because a redirect request submitted too early can be contested and reversed before the funds pool in the distribution account, they timed the strike for the exact hour the liquidity hit maximum density. "It maximizes leverage." She paused, her brow furrowing as she noticed a discrepancy in the data architecture. Her fingers moved rapidly again, expanding a hidden directory within the audit trail. "Wait," Talia murmured, the professional detachment in her voice slipping for the very first time. "This is not right." Adrian leaned over, trying to read the microscopic text on her screen. "What is it?" Talia did not answer him. She looked directly at me, and the gravity in her eyes signaled that the floor was about to drop out from under us all over again. "Ms. Rutherford," Talia said, her tone suddenly carrying the sharp edge of a federal warning. "The redirect request did not just attach itself to your primary operating account." She pushed a button, and the monitor on the wall split in half. On the left was the frozen payroll batch. On the right, a completely different account profile illuminated in the same glaring red restricted status. "They did not just try to take the payroll," Talia stated, pointing at the new data block. "The continuity packet was also used to execute a hostile sweep request on the corporate payroll tax escrow. They attempted to seize the federal withholding funds. The psychological assault began long before a single dollar was ever scheduled to move out of the banking network. While I was still standing in the polished mahogany conference room of Summit Harbor Bank, actively blocking the fraudulent transfer, the secondary phase of their operation had already launched. It was invisible, digital, and infinitely more damaging than a simple frozen account. My phone, resting silently in my blazer pocket, began to vibrate with a continuous, rhythmic urgency. It was not a single call. It was a cascade of notifications. As I walked out of the private wealth wing and into the bright morning sunlight of the parking lot, I pulled the device out and looked at the lock screen. The messages were not from my banking contacts. They were from two of my earliest minor angel investors and a former senior advisory board member. I opened the first message. The investor was asking for a sudden, unscheduled emergency alignment meeting. The second message was worse. It was a forwarded email, completely out of context, asking if the rumors about a potential restructuring were true. My parents had not waited to see if their bank heist would be successful. The moment I walked into the branch, they had started making phone calls. They were working their way down the oldest pages of my contact directory, planting perfectly calibrated seeds of doubt. They were playing the role of the deeply concerned elders, whispering to my financial backers that I was losing my grip on the company. They painted a picture of a founder overwhelmed by rapid expansion, cracking under the intense pressure of corporate leadership. They were quietly suggesting that Northline was speeding toward a cliff, and that family intervention was the only way to prevent a catastrophic crash. By the time I sat down in the driver's seat of my car, the poison had seeped from the investor pool directly into the veins of my own office. My screen lit up with a secure text from my Director of Human Resources. Penelope, there is a rumor circulating on the 5th floor. Several department heads are asking if there is a liquidity issue today. Someone told the sales team that leadership instability might delay the bi-weekly direct deposits. People are starting to panic. How do you want me to handle this? I gripped the leather steering wheel. The sheer toxicity of the tactic washing over me in the corporate ecosystem. You can survive a bad quarter. You can survive a lost client, but payroll is a sacred, unbreakable covenant. The absolute fastest way to destroy a healthy company from the inside out is to threaten the livelihood of the workforce. If employees believe their paychecks are tied to unpredictable leadership drama, the culture shatters within hours. Resumes get updated by noon, and competitors start poaching your top talent by the end of the day. My parents knew exactly how fragile that trust was, and they were deliberately setting fire to it right before the workday officially started. I did not draft a long, defensive explanation. Arguing with a rumor only gives it oxygen, and issuing a frantic denial would only make me look exactly as unhinged as my parents claimed I was. I opened my executive communication portal and typed a single, sterile paragraph to be broadcast to the entire company. Team, an unauthorized routing modification request regarding our primary disbursement vendor is currently under institutional review by our banking partners. This is an external security flag. Standard salary disbursements will be processed and cleared through our secure networks today. No further action or concern is required from any staff member. It was cold. It was factual. It entirely removed the emotional panic from the equation. I hit send, cutting off the internal bleeding for the moment, but the war was far from over. Before I could even put the car in gear, another message flashed on my screen. This one was from Noel Vance, my chief operating officer. It was flagged with the highest priority code we used. Penelope, I just finished the metadata sweep you asked for. The bank attack was not the only breach. The secure access logs for our off-site physical storage facility in the industrial district show an entry from 2 days ago. Someone used the legacy master key code. I checked the inventory registry. The access was isolated to the section holding our original incorporation documents. The air in my car suddenly felt suffocatingly thin. The digital warfare at the bank was a smokescreen for something much older and far more tangible. I did not drive back to the corporate headquarters. I turned the car around and drove straight toward the industrial district on the edge of the city. The storage facility was a massive, windowless concrete bunker designed to hold the physical archives of hundreds of local businesses. It smelled of ozone, industrial floor wax, and dry dust. I swiped my master access card, walked past the security desk, and took the freight elevator to the fourth floor. Row after row of steel shelving stretched out in the dim fluorescent light. I walked rapidly down aisle 17, locating the specific pallet holding the Northline archives from our very first year of operation. These were the boxes containing the foundational paperwork that predated our transition to fully encrypted cloud servers. I pulled the heavy lid off the box labeled for our seed funding cycle. My hands moved quickly, sorting through the manila folders. The original tax identification forms were there. The early commercial leases were there. But the thick blue folder that contained the initial corporate resolutions and the foundational banking mandates was gone. Someone had physically removed the legacy signature samples, the old authorized contact lists, and the original, undigitized startup forms. That was how my father had obtained the archaic continuity packet he presented to the bank this morning. He had literally raided my historical files. But as I stood there in the quiet, dusty aisle, staring at the empty space in the box, a much darker realization began to form in my mind. The continuity packet was dangerous, yes, but it was just a tool to hold the money. Why go through the immense legal risk of stealing physical documents just to delay a single biweekly payroll batch? My parents were ruthless, but they were not foolish. They would not risk federal charges for a temporary inconvenience. I closed my eyes, forcing my memory to rewind a decade, back to the desperate, terrifying months when I first launched Northline. I had needed $50,000 to secure my first major municipal contract. Traditional lenders had laughed at me. My parents had offered to step in as the initial seed investors, providing a bridge loan to get the company off the ground. At the time, I thought it was an act of parental faith. I had signed their customized term sheet without a second thought. The exact wording of the penalty clause from that ancient contract suddenly materialized in my memory, sharp and cold as a razor. It was a standard investor protection mechanism, designed to safeguard their initial capital if I proved to be an incompetent founder. The clause stated explicitly that if the company failed to successfully execute a scheduled payroll distribution more than one time within a single fiscal quarter, it legally constituted an event of severe operational distress. If that threshold was crossed, the original seed guarantor was granted the unilateral right to petition for immediate, temporary financial oversight to protect the underlying asset. My breath caught in my throat. The storage units seemed to spin slightly around me. They did not need to successfully steal the payroll today. They did not actually care if Rutherford Reserve Partners ever saw a single dime of the money. The entire bank ambush was a theatrical distraction. All they needed was for the payroll batch to fail. They just needed the clock to run out today, leaving my employees unpaid by the 5 o'clock deadline. If the money did not move, it counted as a structural failure. And then, the final, most terrifying puzzle piece locked violently into place. I leaned heavily against the cold steel of the shelving unit. 6 weeks ago. Exactly 1 month and a half ago. Right at the beginning of the current fiscal quarter. We had experienced a massive, unprecedented vendor system glitch. The automated clearinghouse portal had simply locked us out for 4 hours. We had narrowly missed the morning distribution window, and the salaries had dropped into employee accounts late in the evening. At the time, Noelle and I had spent hours screaming at the software provider, assuming it was a routine server timeout. We had apologized to the staff, blamed the technology, and moved on. I had thought it was just a technical anomaly. I had been completely blind. That was not a glitch. That was an orchestrated sabotage. That was strike one. My parents had engineered that delay 6 weeks ago to quietly log the first infraction on the corporate record. And today, right here in the middle of the same quarter, they had triggered this massive banking crisis to force strike two. They had perfectly calculated the exact threshold required to activate the ancient, forgotten clause they had stolen from this very room. I walked out of the storage facility, the bright morning sun feeling entirely disconnected from the cold reality settling in my chest. The trap had not been set this morning in the private banking wing. It had been armed 6 weeks ago, carefully and patiently, by the two people who had raised me, They were not just trying to embarrass me. They were methodically executing a flawless, legally binding hostile takeover, and I was exactly one missed banking deadline away from losing everything I had ever built. My phone vibrated against the leather passenger seat of my car. The caller identification displayed Noel Vance, my chief operating officer. I answered the call, keeping my breathing perfectly measured despite the adrenaline flooding my system. "Tell me you found something concrete," I said, my voice sharp and demanding in the quiet space of the vehicle. "I found the missing link," Noelle replied, her tone matching my intensity. "I spent the last hour running a deep background check on the external technical contractor who handled our payment gateway migration last quarter. Do you remember the system architect who supposedly bungled the integration?" "I remember him vividly," I said. "We almost fired the entire vendor agency because of that delay." "His legal name is Marcus Vance," Noelle continued. "He has no relation to me, but I pulled his independent corporate registration. His exact state identification number perfectly matches the registered agent who filed the foundational paperwork to open Rutherford Reserve Partners exactly 13 days ago. The entire architecture of their treason was suddenly laid bare in the morning light. The pieces interlocked with sickening precision. The vendor system failure 6 weeks ago was never a technical glitch. It was a dry run. It was an engineered, deliberate failure orchestrated by a contractor secretly on my parents' payroll, designed specifically to log the first official strike against my company's performance. The stolen continuity documents from the storage unit, the fabricated narrative of my mental instability, the hijacked payroll today, and Owen's desperate need for a bridge loan extension. It was an airtight, multi-stage siege. Anger, hot and blinding, threatened to completely fracture my composure. For a dangerous moment, I wanted to put the car in drive, return straight to the private banking suite, shatter the heavy glass doors, and scream my father's crimes into the immaculate lobby. I wanted to tear down their refined facade in front of everyone, but I forced the rage down into a cold, dark place in my chest. I recognized the trap. That was exactly what they were waiting for. In the corporate world, anger from a woman is immediately weaponized as hysteria. If I walked into that bank screaming and making wild accusations, I would hand them the final, undeniable piece of evidence they needed. I would perfectly embody the unstable, exhausted founder they described in their fraudulent medical narrative. I had to remain entirely clinical. "Lock down the shadow payroll," I ordered Noelle. "Make absolutely certain the secondary processor has the clean routing numbers. I am going to let them think they are still winning." I ended the call and immediately dialed a direct encrypted line to Talia Mercer, back at the private banking suite. She answered on the second ring. "Talia, I need a highly specific tactical favor," I said, my tone strictly professional. "Do not lift the restricted status on the primary banking interface. Leave the red warning banners exactly where they are on the monitors. I want my parents to look at those screens and firmly believe they still have me entirely cornered. You are playing an incredibly dangerous game, Ms. Rutherford," Talia replied, though I could hear a distinct trace of professional respect beneath her warning. "Leaving the hold visible means the system still actively registers those funds as blocked. I have a shadow batch running on a secondary processor right now," I assured her. "My employees will receive their salaries on time. But if my parents think they have already won the board, they might get sloppy with their next move. I want you to place a silent alert, a ghost tripwire, on every single tier of the Northline financial architecture. The payroll, the tax escrow, the operational reserve, and the client trust accounts. If anyone from that branch network even breathes on my ledgers, I want a silent, immediate notification sent directly to my personal device." "Understood," Talia said smoothly. "The tripwires are active and completely invisible on the front end." My next call was to Roland Keene. Roland was my external corporate counsel, a man who possessed the legal equivalent of a military sniper rifle. He did not waste time with basic pleasantries. "Roland, I am facing an active, hostile takeover orchestrated from inside my own family," I stated plainly, pulling out of the storage facility parking lot. They are weaponizing a legacy seed capital clause from 10 years ago by deliberately sabotaging my bi-weekly disbursement cycles. I need you to draft an emergency civil injunction immediately. I also need a comprehensive legal filing prepared to completely invalidate the foundational oversight clauses based on active, verifiable fraud. Give me the names of the actors and the shell company involved, Roland demanded, his voice dropping into a sharp, predatory cadence. I provided him with every detail I had uncovered. I will have the injunction formatted and ready before the federal courts close at 5 o'clock, Roland confirmed. Do not engage them in any binding negotiations without my physical presence. I am not going to negotiate with them, I replied, a grim, heavy satisfaction settling deeply into my bones. I am going to invite them to dinner. I disconnected the call and pulled my car over to the side of the road. I opened a direct message thread to my mother. I carefully crafted the text to sound exactly like a woman who was slowly suffocating under the immense weight of the morning's crisis. Mother, I cannot do this at the bank. The rumors are already starting at the office, and the investors are calling me. Please, can we just meet tonight to discuss a temporary arrangement 8 o'clock at the Oakmont Club? Just you, Father, and me. The reply came back less than 2 minutes later. It dripped with exactly the kind of condescending, maternal victory I had anticipated. Of course, darling. We only want what is best for you and the company. We will see you at 8 o'clock. They genuinely thought I was surrendering. They thought I was coming to the Oakmont Club, their absolute favorite territory, surrounded by their wealthy, judgmental peers, to quietly sign away my life's work in exchange for a few released payroll checks. They had absolutely no idea I was bringing a guillotine to the dinner table. I drove back to my office and spent the next several hours in total lockdown, coordinating silently with Noel to ensure the secondary payroll processor was entirely secure. The shadow batch was clean. Every single employee would receive their standard salary precisely at 4 o'clock this afternoon, completely bypassing the frozen Summit Harbor accounts. At exactly 3 o'clock, I was sitting alone at my desk, reviewing the finalized injunction documents Roland had securely transmitted to my tablet, when my phone screen flashed with a bright, silent white notification block. It was the ghost tripwire Talia had installed. I opened the encrypted alert, my heart rate steadying into a cold rhythm. The banking system had just detected a new, highly aggressive access attempt originating from the exact same virtual private network my parents were utilizing. But this time, they were not looking at the payroll or the federal tax escrow. They were attempting to breach the client reserve account. The client reserve was the absolute holy grail of the Northline infrastructure. It was a heavily protected holding pool where we stored the massive upfront retainer fees and contractual deposits from our enterprise clients before those funds were legally cleared for operational use. It contained millions of dollars that did not technically belong to me yet. It was the most sensitive, highly regulated pool of capital in my entire ecosystem. Touching it without explicit audited authorization was not just a breach of basic contract, it was a devastating criminal violation of fiduciary trust. I stared at the blinking digital alert, watching the last lingering shred of familial illusion burn away into ash. They were not just trying to prove I was temporarily incompetent, so they could graciously manage my company for a few months. They were actively trying to gain access to the client reserve to completely collateralize Owen's massive, failing commercial real estate debt. If they managed to illegally pledge those specific trust funds to Briargate Capital, even for 48 hours, and Owen's real estate deal collapsed anyway, Northline would be instantly dragged into a catastrophic federal bankruptcy. They were entirely willing to annihilate my company, ruin my employees, and risk my personal freedom just to bail out my sister's husband. There was absolutely no more room for hesitation or doubt. This was not a misguided, heavy-handed parental intervention born out of twisted love. This was a meticulously designed, cold-blooded corporate slaughter. I closed the security alert, locked my tablet, and stood up from my heavy oak desk. I straightened my blazer and looked out the window over the city I had helped build. The terrified, overworked daughter they were expecting to meet at the Oakmont Club tonight was officially dead. Penelope Rutherford, the chief executive, was going to dinner instead. The Oakmont Club always smelled of old money, polished brass, and the quiet, ruthless execution of corporate deals. I arrived at exactly 8 o'clock in the evening. The valet took my keys, and I walked through the heavy oak doors, deliberately projecting the image of a woman who had spent the last 12 hours fighting a desperate, losing battle. I wore a simple, unstructured coat over my wrinkled office clothes. My hair was tied back loosely. I made sure there were faint, dark circles visible under my eyes. My phone was buried deep inside the inner pocket of my leather handbag. The secure voice recording application already running, capturing every ambient sound in crystal-clear, high-definition audio. The maitre d' led me through the main dining room, past tables filled with the city's elite, toward a private dining alcove tucked away in the back. They were already there, waiting like a tribunal. My father, Graham, sat at the head of the heavy mahogany table. My mother, Elise, sat to his immediate right, sipping a glass of expensive red wine, but they were not alone. My younger sister, Daphne, sat across from them, her shoulders hunched, staring intently at the condensation forming on her crystal water glass. Next to her sat Owen, leaning back in his chair with a smug, deeply unearned confidence radiating from his posture. I pulled out my chair and sat down slowly. I did not order a drink. I did not offer a greeting. I just looked at them, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Graham did not bother resurrecting the warm, paternal facade he had worn at the bank that morning. The environment here was his absolute domain, surrounded by his wealthy peers, and he felt entirely in control of the narrative. He folded his hands on the stark white tablecloth and looked at me with cold, calculating authority. "We are done playing games, Penelope," Graham stated, his voice flat and commanding, stripping away any pretense of family affection. "Your company has clearly outgrown your capacity to effectively lead it. The market is far too volatile, and your internal systems are demonstrably failing. Northline needs to be placed under a much more mature family structure immediately. Owen and I will assume executive oversight for the next 90 days to stabilize the asset and reassure the markets." I looked at him, letting a perfect mix of manufactured exhaustion and disbelief wash over my face. "A mature family structure? You mean the empty shell company you legally registered just 13 days ago?" Elise did not miss a single beat. She reached into her designer tote bag, retrieved a perfectly bound document, and slid it smoothly across the table. It stopped directly in front of my empty dinner plate. "This is a temporary treasury stabilization agreement," Elise said softly. Her tone was carefully modulated, but her eyes were devoid of empathy. "It is a standard protective measure, darling. It simply grants Rutherford Reserve Partners the legal authority to intercept your incoming cash flow, manage your primary banking relationships, and execute operational drafts until you fully recover from your current state of nervous exhaustion." I stared at the thick stack of premium paper. They wanted total, uncontested control of the vault. I slowly flipped to the second page, scanning the dense legal justification they had attached to the demand. My eyes locked onto a specific reference citing the initial seed capital they had provided over a decade ago. "That money was an unconditional family loan," I said, keeping my voice deliberately shaky, playing the role of the cornered, desperate victim to perfection. "We agreed on that when I signed the papers in your living room. I paid it back with interest 7 years ago." Elise offered a thin, aristocratic smile that did not reach her eyes. "It was unconditional, as long as the company remained healthy and well-managed. But you never fully read the secondary addendums we filed with the state registry. Did you?" "There was a protective covenant attached to that original tranche of capital. It clearly states that in the event of severe operational distress, the original guarantors retain the absolute right to assume emergency financial control to protect the underlying value of the firm." The sheer, breathtaking toxicity of her revelation hung heavily in the air. I looked at my mother, a woman who had proudly bought my first business suit, and realized she had planted a dormant legal virus in my company's foundation on the very first day of its existence. They had not waited for an actual crisis to happen naturally. They had meticulously engineered the vendor system failure 6 weeks ago, and they had violently hijacked my bank accounts this morning, specifically to manufacture the exact operational distress required to trigger their hidden trap. They had built the bomb, and then they had blamed me for the explosion. I turned my gaze to Daphne. My sister looked paler than usual, wrapped tightly in a thick cashmere shawl that seemed to swallow her small frame. She refused to meet my eyes, focusing entirely on the table. She was weak, but she was absolutely not innocent. She knew exactly what was happening tonight. Her massive suburban estate, her luxury vehicles, and her exclusive country club memberships were entirely dependent on Owen surviving his impending commercial real estate bankruptcy. She was perfectly willing to sit in absolute silence while her husband and her parents cannibalized my life's work just to keep her checking account full. Owen shifted in his seat, eager to assert his relevance in the room. He leaned forward, resting his forearms heavily on the table. "Look, Penelope, there is no need to make this a massive family tragedy," Owen said, a condescending smirk playing on his lips. "It is just business mechanics. Briargate Capital is holding my bridge loan hostage. I just need to prove to them that a few cycles of massive corporate cash flow are passing through our family structure. Once they see the Northline routing statements clearing through my reserve entity, they will open the capital rescue valve for my plaza project. You sign the paper. We wrote the money for a few months, and everybody gets exactly what they want." He was admitting it, right out in the open, arrogant and entirely unfiltered. He was freely confessing that he intended to use my corporate revenue as a fraudulent collateral prop to save his own sinking ship. I looked back at my father. I needed the final nail for the legal coffin. I needed him to explicitly articulate the extortion on the recording. I let my shoulders slump drastically, taking a ragged, uneven breath. "You stopped my employees from getting paid today," I whispered, injecting a heavy dose of raw, helpless panic into my tone. "They have mortgages to pay. They have children to feed. If the money does not clear tomorrow morning, the company will shatter from the inside out. You cannot do this to them." Graham's face darkened with sudden, volatile irritation. He despised weakness, even when it was the exact weakness he was aggressively trying to extract from me. He slammed his hand flat against the table, the sharp sound rattling the expensive silverware. "Missing a single payroll cycle hurts. Penelope," Graham snapped, his voice tight with aggressive impatience, ringing loud and clear across the alcove. "But it is enough to force you to sign the agreement. You brought this entirely on yourself by refusing to listen to reason at the bank this morning. Sign the document right now, and the restriction on the funds gets lifted immediately. It is that simple." There it was. The absolute, undeniable confession of financial sabotage and illegal extortion. It was now safe and secure on the encrypted digital storage drive of my hidden phone. I looked down at my hands, letting a long, heavy silence stretch across the table, playing my part to the bitter end. When I finally spoke, my voice was small, fractured, and utterly defeated. "I cannot read this right now," I said, pushing the temporary Treasury stabilization agreement back toward the center of the table with a trembling hand. "My head is spinning. I cannot focus. I need until tomorrow morning. I need to take this home and read the terms clearly before I sign away my entire authority." Graham exchanged a quick, triumphant look with Owen. They genuinely thought they had broken me completely. They thought they had pushed me right to the absolute edge of my endurance, and now I was simply begging for a few hours of grace before the inevitable surrender. "Fine," Graham said, adjusting his silk tie with a sharp, intensely satisfied movement. "You have until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. We will meet back at the private banking branch. Bring the signed agreement, and we will authorize the release of the funds." I stood up slowly, making sure my movements looked stiff and deeply uncoordinated. I did not say goodbye to any of them. I turned and walked out of the private dining alcove, navigating blindly through the softly lit tables of the Oakmont Club. The exact moment I stepped through the heavy front doors and out into the cool, sharp night air, the entire facade of the broken daughter evaporated instantly. My posture straightened into a rigid line. My breathing leveled out into a slow, perfectly measured rhythm. I reached deep into my handbag, pulled out my phone, and permanently stopped the recording. I immediately uploaded the encrypted high-definition audio file to 3 separate secure cloud servers. As I walked toward my car in the valet lot, a profound, icy clarity settled over me. I was no longer fighting a desperate defensive battle just to save a single cycle of employee salaries. That war was already silently won behind the scenes. I was now holding a loaded, fully documented legal weapon, and I was preparing to drag my family's entire fraudulent, extortionate charade directly into the blinding light of public and legal scrutiny. They wanted to play a ruthless game of corporate destruction in the shadows. I was going to show them exactly how a true chief executive finishes one in the daylight. The sun had barely broken over the city skyline on Tuesday morning when the final phase of their offensive officially launched. They did not even wait for our scheduled 9 o'clock rendezvous at the Summit Harbor branch. By 7 in the morning, my primary legal counsel, Roland Keene, forwarded me a massive, encrypted digital package that my parents had mass distributed to every single minority investor on the Northline capitalization table. It was a formal petition for temporary financial oversight. They had weaponized the ancient startup clause to its absolute limit. The petition aggressively cited the manufactured delays and included a heavily redacted version of the medical incapacity narrative they had presented to the bank. They were legally demanding that the investor syndicate back a mandatory transition of executive control to Rutherford Reserve Partners for a period of 90 days. Simultaneously, Noel Vance intercepted a calendar update from an industry contact. Owen had formally scheduled an in-person presentation at the downtown headquarters of Briargate Capital for 2 o'clock in the afternoon. His agenda was boldly listed as a structural collateral review. He was going to walk into the offices of his massive institutional lender and present my company as his newly acquired, fully compliant family asset. They were moving with breathtaking speed, trying to outrun any potential legal defense I could mount. They wanted the narrative set in stone before lunch. I sat at my desk, the early morning light casting long shadows across my office, and decided it was time to completely sever their leverage. I opened a secure voice channel to Noel. Execute the shadow batch. Bypass the primary accounts completely. Push the entire bi-weekly disbursement through the secondary vendor pipeline. Running a secondary processor is incredibly complicated. It requires authorizing a completely distinct origin point for the funds, moving liquid capital from an undisclosed operational reserve, and paying an exorbitant premium fee for same-day wire clearances. But the cost was utterly irrelevant. What mattered was the absolute certainty that every single employee would receive their full salary by noon. The authorization is complete, Noelle confirmed, her voice crackling with nervous energy over the secure line. The funds are actively routing, but Penelope, if we do this, the Summit Harbor accounts remain locked. Your parents will still see the red banners on their end. That is exactly the point, I replied, a cold, strategic calm washing over me. I want them walking into Briargate Capital firmly believing that my payroll is still bleeding out on the operating table. Let them confidently promise the lenders a hostage they no longer hold. The morning dissolved into a blur of tactical, surgical strikes. My office transformed into a forensic war room. Noelle had spent the entire night running a deep metadata extraction on the continuity packet my father had submitted to the bank. When she finally walked into my office at 10 o'clock, she placed a single, printed spreadsheet on my desk. "You are going to want to frame this," Noelle said, her eyes gleaming with predatory satisfaction. I scanned the raw digital footprints, the document outlining my supposed severe neurological stress and executive incapacitation was not drafted by a medical professional or legal counsel. The hidden file properties proved it was authored exactly 4 days ago, and the originating device identification matched a desktop computer registered directly to the corporate local area network at the commercial real estate office owned by Owen. My brother-in-law had literally typed up my fake mental breakdown between meetings about his failing plaza project. 15 minutes later, Talia Mercer delivered the next piece of heavy artillery. A secure email arrived from the Risk Management Division of Summit Harbor Bank. It was a formal, digitally watermarked letter of institutional assessment. Talia had pulled the complete commercial history of Rutherford Reserve Partners. The letter officially confirmed, in stark legal terminology, that the entity had absolutely no licensing, no compliance framework, and zero historical precedent of acting as a fiduciary manager for any legitimate corporate treasury. It was legally classified as a high-risk shell company. I forwarded both the metadata logs and the bank assessment directly to Roland Keene. "I have the ammunition," I told him over the phone. "Now I need the audience." Roland's laugh was a dry, scraping sound that promised absolute legal devastation. "Consider it done. I have already reached out to the senior partners at Briargate Capital. I informed them that the Chief Executive Officer of Northline Workforce Advisory would be attending the 2 o'clock collateral review to provide critical context regarding the family structure transition. They were thrilled to accommodate. They think you are coming to officially bless the arrangement." "And the others?" I asked. "I have secured attendance from Marina Holt, the lead compliance officer for your payroll processing vendor." Roland confirmed. "Talia Mercer is attending as the institutional banking representative. I also invited the legal counsel representing your 3 largest minority investors. None of them have informed your parents. Your father and Owen think they are walking into a private, standard lending negotiation. The trap was set, perfectly engineered and entirely invisible." I spent the next hour preparing my physical armor. In a corporate execution, aesthetics are a psychological weapon. I deliberately chose a charcoal gray suit that was just slightly too loose, giving the subtle illusion of recent weight loss. I brushed my hair back into a severe utilitarian knot. I applied my makeup sparingly, ensuring the pallor of extreme stress was still the dominant feature of my face. I needed to look exactly like the defeated, exhausted woman who had begged for extra time at the club the night before. I had to project the energy of a founder who was walking into the room to formally surrender her crown. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, I ordered a Blacktown car to take me to the financial district. The ride was silent. I watched the towering glass and steel structures of the city pass by my window, feeling the immense gravity of the impending collision. I was not nervous. The fear had completely burned away, leaving behind a sharp, crystalline focus. The Briargate Capitol building was an intimidating monolith of dark glass and brushed steel. I took the express elevator to the 42nd floor. The reception area was expansive, minimal, and terrifyingly quiet. Roland Keene was already waiting for me near a massive indoor water feature. He looked immaculate in a dark navy suit, carrying a sleek leather briefcase that contained enough forensic evidence to annihilate a small nation. He gave me a single, approving nod. "They are already inside," Roland murmured as we walked down the wide, carpeted corridor toward the executive conference suites. Owen requested the primary glass boardroom. He wants maximum visibility for his big moment. We approached the heavy glass doors of the designated room. Through the transparent walls, I could see them perfectly. My father was standing near the head of the long marble table, adjusting his tie, projecting absolute, dominating authority. My mother sat gracefully in a modern leather chair, reviewing a printed presentation deck with serene confidence. Owen was standing near the massive floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city, holding a cup of coffee, beaming with the relaxed, arrogant posture of a man who firmly believed his massive debts were completely wiped clean. They looked victorious. They were smiling, chatting easily with the junior lending partners as they waited for the senior directors to arrive. They possessed the sheer, intoxicating confidence of people who thought they were exactly one signature away from winning the ultimate prize. I placed my hand on the cold steel handle of the boardroom door, my posture still carefully projecting defeat, while my heart beat with the steady, lethal rhythm of an executioner stepping onto the scaffold. I pushed the door open and walked into the room. The heavy glass door clicked shut behind me, sealing the room. The ambient hum of the city 40 stories below vanished entirely, replaced by the hushed, expectant silence of high-stakes corporate finance. I kept my gaze lowered, my shoulders rigidly tense, playing the role of the broken executive perfectly. I took a seat near the far end of the polished marble table, as far away from the power center as physically possible. Roland Keene sat quietly beside me, placing his sleek leather briefcase on the surface with a soft thud. My father did not miss a single beat. He looked at the senior directors of Briargate Capital, radiating the warm, steady authority of a seasoned patriarch stepping in to save the day. "Gentlemen, I want to thank you for accommodating this transition review on such short notice," Graham began, his voice a masterclass in manufactured empathy. He gestured toward me with a perfectly manicured hand. "My daughter, Penelope, is an incredibly talented founder. What she has built over the last decade is nothing short of remarkable. However, as I am sure you are aware, the sheer velocity of that growth has become a severe operational liability. She is exhausted. The infrastructure is fracturing. We are entirely committed to her legacy, which is exactly why the family is stepping in to provide temporary stabilization. We need to protect the employees, secure the corporate reputation, and ensure the asset continues to perform." It was a beautiful, poisonous lie. He sounded so incredibly reasonable, so deeply burdened by the heavy responsibility of saving his brilliant but fragile child. The senior lending partner at the head of the table, a man with silver hair and a sharp, calculating gaze, nodded slowly, clearly receptive to the narrative. Elise seamlessly picked up the thread. She leaned forward, projecting an aura of sophisticated financial pragmatism. "Think of this transition as a vital liquidity preservation measure," she explained smoothly. "We are simply rerouting the primary disbursement streams to prevent Northline from stumbling because it grew too fast. By placing the operational cash flow under our direct oversight, we instantly eliminate the risk of executive burnout impacting the vendor networks or the workforce. It is a protective buffer, nothing more." Then, it was Owen's turn. He could not hide the greedy, triumphant gleam in his eyes. He stood up, pacing slightly near the massive windows, eager to sell the empty shell company he had registered just 2 weeks prior. "Exactly," Owen said, projecting a loud, overly confident energy. "And that is where Rutherford Reserve Partners comes into play. It is a highly dynamic, flexible treasury vehicle. Right now, it is stepping in to manage the Northline payroll distributions. But looking at our immediate forecast, we are actively preparing to manage multiple corporate operational streams through this exact same structure. It is an institutional-grade holding entity, fully capable of collateralizing significant debt structures by utilizing these massive, recurring cash flows." I sat perfectly still, listening to the sound of my brother-in-law actively committing federal financial fraud in a room full of people. He was explicitly promising Briargate Capital that they could use my company's revenue as collateral for his failing commercial real estate loans. The lenders were visibly intrigued. In the cold calculus of private equity, a distressed founder was a risk, but a steady, guaranteed stream of bi-weekly corporate cash flow managed by a compliant family trust was an incredibly attractive asset. The senior partner flipped open his notebook, a slight smile touching his lips. He was buying every single word. "Recurring, predictable cash flow is certainly what we like to see when discussing loan extensions," the senior partner noted, looking directly at Owen. "If you can guarantee the treasury management remains under this stabilized family structure for the next 12 to 18 months, we can certainly discuss restructuring the bridge loan." I did not interrupt. I let the silence stretch. I let them bask in the absolute certainty of their victory. I let the lie sink its roots so deeply into the concrete floor of the boardroom that there would be absolutely no way to rip it out without tearing the entire structure down. They had spoken long enough, confidently enough, and deep enough to permanently bind themselves to the fraudulent narrative. When the senior partner finally turned his gaze toward me, offering a look of condescending pity, expecting my formal verbal surrender, I slowly lifted my head. I dropped the exhausted posture. I straightened my spine against the back of the heavy leather chair. The manufactured fear completely vanished from my face, replaced by a cold, absolute calm that immediately sucked the warmth out of the room. "I have just one small question," I said. My voice was no longer shaky or small. It rang out crisp, sharp, and entirely devoid of emotion. Graham frowned, a flicker of genuine uncertainty crossing his eyes for the very first time. Owen stopped pacing. I looked directly at the senior lending partner. "Has anyone in this room ever seen a valid authentication from the actual account that owns the payroll?" The question hung in the air, sudden and jarring. The senior partner blinked, clearly confused by the sudden shift in my demeanor. "I am sorry, Ms. Rutherford. I was under the impression that the Treasury transition was fully authorized by your internal protocols." Before my father could open his mouth to deploy another lie, Marina Holt stood up from her seat near the back wall. She was the lead compliance officer for my primary disbursement vendor, entirely invisible to my family until this exact second. She stepped into the light, holding a thick, legally binding verification ledger. "I can answer that," Marina stated firmly. "My name is Marina Holt, representing the primary payroll processing architecture for Northline Workforce Advisory. I can officially confirm for the record that there has been absolutely no valid request to reroute the disbursement streams. The system has registered 0 commands originating from Ms. Rutherford's biometric device, her physical cryptographic token, or her standard verified protocol. The request currently holding the funds hostage was initiated through an archaic, obsolete contact tier that bypasses all modern corporate security standards." The color instantly drained from Owen's face. He looked at Marina, then at my father, panic suddenly bleeding into his arrogant posture. "That is simply a technicality," Graham interjected loudly, his voice rising in volume as he tried to regain control of the room. "The continuity packet we submitted to the bank clearly grants us the legal authority to override those standard security protocols during an executive emergency." "The bank accepted the documentation. Did they?" a new voice asked. Talia Mercer stepped forward from the opposite side of the room. She placed her banking data pad on the marble table, her face an unreadable mask of institutional authority. "Talia Mercer, Regional Director of Risk Management for Summit Harbor Bank," she introduced herself, her eyes locking onto my parents. "I can assure everyone in this room that the bank has not accepted the documentation. In fact, the continuity packet submitted by Graham and Elise Rutherford triggered a Tier 1 security review. And during that review, we discovered something deeply concerning." Talia tapped her screen, and the data illuminated her face in the dimming afternoon light. "Mr. and Mrs. Rutherford did not just attempt to implement a temporary stabilization measure on the payroll," Talia continued, her voice slicing through the boardroom like a scalpel. "Bank records indicate not just one, but 3 distinct, unauthorized attempts to touch the corporate liquidity. They targeted the primary payroll account. They targeted the federal tax escrow fund. And most egregiously, they attempted to breach the highly protected client reserve account." A heavy, suffocating silence slammed into the room. The senior partner from Briargate Capital slowly closed his notebook. The casual, friendly atmosphere was instantly annihilated. Attempting to seize payroll was an aggressive corporate maneuver. Attempting to seize federal tax funds and client trust reserves was a fast track to a federal indictment. Elise gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning bone white. Graham stood frozen, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle twitched violently in his cheek. They were entirely surrounded, completely outflanked by the very people they thought were irrelevant to their scheme. Roland Keene casually flicked the brass latches on his leather briefcase. They snapped open with a sharp, explosive sound that made Owen physically flinch. Roland reached inside and pulled out a small electronic remote. "I believe context is everything in high-level finance," Roland said, his voice dripping with absolute legal menace. He pointed the remote at the massive, 80-inch high-definition monitor mounted on the far wall of the boardroom. "Perhaps it would be best if we turned on the main screen. I have prepared a full timeline of events for the lenders to review." The screen flared to life, casting a bright, unforgiving light over the terrified faces of my family. From that exact moment, the sophisticated investment meeting ceased to exist, rapidly devolving into a devastating, inescapable session of profound self-incrimination. The 80-inch high-definition monitor flared to life, casting a stark, blinding white light across the terrified faces of my family. Roland Keene stood near the head of the marble table, holding a sleek presentation remote. He did not look like a corporate lawyer anymore. He looked like an executioner reading a list of condemned charges. On the screen, a severe chronological timeline appeared, cutting across a black background. Brilliant red nodes marked each specific point of their conspiracy. "Digital forensics are wonderfully unforgiving," Roland began, his voice echoing sharply against the glass walls of the boardroom. He clicked the remote, and the first node expanded. It all began exactly 6 weeks ago. The mysterious vendor system failure that delayed the Northline payroll by 4 hours. We have traced the origin of that specific disruption directly to an independent technical contractor. That exact same contractor legally filed the incorporation papers for Rutherford Reserve Partners. It was not a glitch. It was a dry run to establish a historical precedent of operational failure. My father shifted his weight, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. "This is a gross misrepresentation of internal company metrics. You have no right to present this here." Roland ignored him entirely and clicked the remote again. The timeline surged forward. Node 2, the physical breach of the Northline off-site storage facility. Security logs indicate the legacy access codes were used to remove the original, undigitized founding documents. Node 3, exactly 13 days ago, the legal formation of the shell company. Node 4, the submission of the forged continuity packet this morning. Forged is an incredibly dangerous word to use in a room full of attorneys. "Mr. Keene," Owen interrupted, his voice pitching higher than normal, completely devoid of his previous arrogance. "Those documents were generated based on legitimate medical concerns regarding Penelope's executive stability. I am so glad you brought up the generation of those documents," Roland countered smoothly, his eyes locking onto Owen with absolute predatory delight. He clicked the remote. The screen split in half. On the left side, the dense legal text of the medical incapacitation narrative appeared. On the right side, a block of raw, irrefutable metadata filled the monitor. "As I said, digital forensics are unforgiving," Roland repeated. "The metadata embedded in the incapacitation file clearly indicates that the document was authored exactly 4 days ago. Furthermore, the Internet Protocol address attached to the final save state matches the local area network of a commercial real estate office, specifically, your office, Owen. You drafted a fraudulent medical assessment of your sister-in-law between your own failing project meetings." Owen opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at the senior lending partner of Briargate Capital, whose face had turned entirely to stone. "And the printed appendix," Roland continued relentlessly, turning his gaze toward my sister, who was actively shrinking into her leather chair. "The physical paper submitted to Summit Harbor Bank this morning contains microprinter tracking dots. We matched the spool data. The document was printed on a residential wireless network registered to Daphne Rutherford. This was a fully collaborative family effort." Elise sat rigid, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the armrests of her chair so tightly her knuckles were pure white. Graham slammed his fist onto the table. "Enough," Graham barked, dropping the sophisticated patriarch facade entirely. "This is an internal family dispute over asset management. It has absolutely no bearing on the structural integrity of the cash flows we are discussing with Briargate Capital." "It has every bearing on it," Roland corrected him softly. He reached down to his briefcase and pressed a single button on his encrypted audio device. "Because you explicitly outlined the extortion yourself." The crisp, high-definition audio recording from the Oakmont Club filled the silent boardroom. My father's own voice echoed off the glass walls, harsh and impatient. "Missing a single payroll cycle hurts, Penelope, but it is enough to force you to sign the agreement. You brought this entirely on yourself by refusing to listen to reason at the bank this morning. Sign the document right now, and the restriction on the funds gets lifted immediately." The absolute silence that followed the recording was deafening. The extortion was laid bare, stripped of all its protective corporate jargon. They had intentionally suffocated the company to force a hostile transfer of power. The senior lending partner from Briargate Capital finally moved. He stood up from his chair. The polite, interested warmth he had shown Owen 10 minutes ago was completely gone. In its place was the icy, ruthless instinct of institutional self-preservation. When you manage billions of dollars, your only loyalty is to risk mitigation. And my family had just brought a massive, highly radioactive federal fraud scheme directly into his boardroom. "Mr. Rutherford," the senior partner said, his voice dangerously low, turning to face my father, "I am no longer evaluating an investment opportunity. I am evaluating my firm's exposure to federal conspiracy charges. I need a direct, unembellished answer right now. Has a single dollar of legitimate corporate wage capital ever successfully traversed your holding entity?" Graham opened his mouth to spin another layer of justification, but I did not let him. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the marble table, ensuring the senior partner looked directly at me. "Not one single cent," I answered for them, my voice steady and cold. "They built a cardboard cutout of a treasury management firm. They slapped my family name on it without my consent, hijacked my foundational documents, and brought it into your office to secure a debt extension they cannot afford. The cash flow they promised you is a complete illusion." "But the illusion was not quite enough for them, was it?" Roland interjected, moving in for the absolute kill. He reached into his briefcase one final time and pulled out a single, heavily formalized sheet of paper. He slid it across the long table until it stopped directly in front of the senior partner. "In the discovery process this morning, we intercepted a draft side letter filed in the Briargate digital portal," Roland explained, the final hammer blow descending. "Graham, Elise, and Owen legally promised your firm that a 20% slice of Northline's projected third-quarter receivables would act as a supplemental liquidity cushion for Owen's personal real estate bridge loan. They pledged massive, future corporate assets as collateral, assets they had absolutely zero legal right to touch, authorize, or pledge." The senior partner picked up the paper, his eyes rapidly scanning the text. Disgust twisted his features. He dropped the paper back onto the table as if it were physically contaminated. He looked at Owen with pure, unfiltered contempt. Pledging unowned assets to a federal lending institution was not just a breach of contract, it was a severe criminal offense. The pressure in the room finally reached its breaking point, and the weakest link instantly shattered. Daphne had been trembling violently ever since the audio recording played. When the senior partner threw the side letter down, a sharp, ragged sob tore out of her throat. "We did not want to ruin her," Daphne blurts out, her voice high, frantic, and echoing desperately in the confined glass room. She pointed a shaking finger directly at our mother. "Mother said it was just leverage. She said Penelope would be less stubborn as soon as the employees panicked. We just needed the routing numbers for a few days to show the bank that the money was ours. We were going to give the company back after the loan cleared." Elise closed her eyes. A sharp intake of breath, the only sign that her daughter's confession had just completely annihilated their legal defense. Graham stared at Daphne with an expression of absolute, venomous fury. He looked like he wanted to reach across the table and strike her. I stood up slowly. I smoothed the front of my charcoal jacket. The heavy, defeated posture I had carried into the building was completely gone. I stood at my full height, looking down at the people who had raised me, the people who had cheerfully tried to feed my life's work into a wood chipper just to keep up their own appearances. "There is just one final detail you should all be aware of," I said calmly, breaking the heavy silence left by Daphne's confession. I looked directly into my father's eyes, ensuring he felt the full weight of his total failure. "You held a gun to the head of my company this morning. You genuinely thought my employees were your hostages. But while you were sitting in this beautiful room, confidently selling my future to cover your own debts, I authorized a completely separate shadow disbursement pipeline through a secondary vendor." Graham's eyes widened, the realization finally breaking through his arrogant armor. The restricted hold at Summit Harbor Bank means absolutely nothing to me anymore, I told them, delivering the final, crushing truth. Every single employee of Northline Workforce Advisory received their full correct salary precisely an hour and 15 minutes ago. The only leverage you had just completely vanished into thin air, right in front of everyone. The senior partner of Briargate Capital did not need to hear another syllable. When I stated that the shadow payroll had already cleared and my employees were fully paid, the entire foundation of my family's extortions simply evaporated into the air-conditioned atmosphere of the room. He stood up slowly, buttoning his tailored suit jacket with deliberate, forceful movements. He looked at Owen with a mixture of profound professional disgust and acute legal apprehension. "This meeting is permanently concluded," the senior partner said, his voice dropping to a glacial, uncompromising register. "Briargate Capital formally withdraws from all restructuring negotiations regarding your Commercial Plaza bridge loan. We will not be party to corporate fraud. Expect a formal notice of default from our legal department by 5 o'clock this evening." He did not say goodbye to my parents. He simply picked up his leather portfolio, turned, and walked out of his own boardroom, leaving them standing in the smoking wreckage of their ambition. Talia Mercer did not offer them a single moment to recover from the blow. She reached into her dark navy blazer, retrieved a heavily watermarked document bearing the Summit Harbor Bank institutional seal, and slid it directly across the marble surface toward my father. "This is a formal notice of restriction," Talia stated, her tone stripping away any remaining illusion of customer service. "Effective immediately, any future requests, account modifications, or access attempts submitted by Graham Rutherford, Elise Rutherford, or any entity associated with Rutherford Reserve Partners will be automatically rejected. Furthermore, your personal and corporate banking profiles have been flagged for enhanced institutional review. You are entirely locked out of the Northline financial architecture, permanently." Roland Keene was already packing his briefcase, snapping the heavy brass latches shut with a sound like a gavel striking a wooden block. "And my office will be filing an emergency federal injunction before the courthouse closes," Roland added, looking directly into my mother's terrified eyes. "We are legally invalidating the legacy seed capital clause based on documented, active fraud. First thing tomorrow morning, we are initiating a comprehensive civil lawsuit against all three of you. The charges will include corporate forgery, unauthorized interference in commercial business operations, and severe, calculated reputational damage. You tried to use a fabricated medical narrative to steal a company. Now, you will have to defend that exact narrative under oath in a federal courtroom. The representatives for my minority investors, who had remained entirely silent throughout the bloodbath, quietly gathered their belongings. I knew the minor investors who had received my parents' hysterical petition that morning were already receiving live text updates from their legal counsel in this room. Any hesitation or doubt they might have harbored vanished instantly. In the cutthroat world of corporate finance, investors back the leader who can keep the ship afloat during a Category 5 hurricane. By ensuring every single employee received their salary precisely on time despite a massive, highly coordinated attack on our infrastructure, I had proved my absolute competence. The crisis my parents tried to sell them only solidified my absolute, uncontested authority over my own board of directors. The fracture within their ranks was instantaneous and brutal. Daphne stood up, her face streaked with ruined makeup, completely ignoring her husband. For the first time in her life, she truly understood the exact, devastating cost of her comfortable suburban existence. She had not experienced a sudden moral awakening, but rather the terrifying realization that she had been willingly dragged into a massive federal fraud scheme just to patch the sinking ship of her husband's toxic debt. She picked up her designer bag and walked out of the glass room without looking back at Owen, leaving him staring blankly at the floor as his entire financial future collapsed in real time. Graham and Elise Rutherford were left sitting in the suffocating silence of the massive boardroom. The refined, aristocratic shell of a family stepping in to protect their own had entirely dissolved. Surrounded by irrefutable digital evidence, sworn bank statements, and aggressive legal threats, They were finally exposed for exactly what they were. They were not worried parents saving a stressed daughter. They were just two desperate, ruthless people who had willingly offered their own child's corporate reputation as collateral for their selfish ambition. I looked at them one last time, feeling absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, just the cold, clean emptiness of a completely severed tie. I turned and walked out alongside my team, leaving them trapped in the glass box of their own design. When I returned to my executive office at Northline headquarters, the atmosphere on the floor was perfectly normal. The morning rumor mill had died the exact moment the direct deposit notifications hit my employees' phones early that afternoon. I sat at my desk, opened my corporate communication portal, and drafted a final company-wide memorandum. It was brief, surgical, and entirely professional. Team, earlier today, our security protocols intercepted an unauthorized, external attempt to alter our primary financial routing infrastructure. The attempt was successfully blocked by our internal controls. A secondary vendor pipeline was immediately activated, and all biweekly payroll distributions have been completed with zero delays and absolutely no loss of operating capital. Thank you for your continued focus and dedication. I hit send. It was perfectly clean. It projected absolute stability and completely erased any narrative of vulnerability. But the true climax of my revenge did not happen in the polished boardroom of Briargate Capital, nor did it happen in my executive office. It happened at 8 o'clock that evening, sitting entirely alone at my kitchen island with a simple glass of water and my personal encrypted laptop. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a profound, quiet clarity. I opened my digital security vaults. I systematically removed Graham and Elise Rutherford from every single aspect of my life. I formally revoked their emergency medical proxy. I stripped them from my estate planning documents, severing their access to my personal assets. I deleted their names from my emergency contact lists, my residential security clearances, and my personal trust beneficiaries. One by one, I permanently closed every single door, window, and pathway I had ever left unlocked in the name of familial loyalty. It was the most profound, liberating act of corporate and personal housekeeping I had ever performed in my entire 38 years of life. Before closing my laptop for the night, I opened the Summit Harbor Bank secure application one last time. The harsh, glaring red banner that had started this entire war exactly 12 hours ago was completely gone. In its place, sitting quietly next to my primary corporate operating account, were two beautiful, simple green words: verified cleared. It was not a magical intervention. It was the absolute, undeniable proof that I had won. I had protected my people and my empire through strict discipline, flawless documentation, and the willingness to be perfectly, devastatingly cold exactly when it mattered the most. The true high point of the entire ordeal was not the fight itself. It was the quiet, satisfying realization that the people who spent weeks meticulously building a trap to destroy me were now permanently, legally, and financially suffocating inside it. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts. I invite you to subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button so that this story can be heard by even more people.